Welcome to this journey into the forgotten shadows of American history. I'm your guide through the archives of the unexplained, the keeper of stories that time tried to bury but refused to stay silent. Before we descend into tonight's investigation, I want to know, where are you watching this from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing we're all scattered across different places and time zones, yet we're about to share the same nightmare together. Your engagement keeps our haunted community alive, so please make your presence known. Tonight, we travel to Louisiana. The year is 1876. The Civil War has ended, but its scars run deep across the South. Families have been shattered, communities decimated, and thousands of children left without parents or homes. In this chaos, institutions rose to shelter the forgotten, orphanages that promised safety, warmth, and hope. But what happens when the very place meant to protect becomes a hunting ground? St. Catherine's Orphanage stood 3 miles outside the town of Belmont, Louisiana, surrounded by cypress swamps and perpetual fog. It was a 2-story wooden structure painted white, though the paint had long since begun to peel, revealing the grey, rotting wood beneath. 23 children lived there, under the care of Sister Agnes Thornhill, a stern but devoted woman of 42, and Thomas Rave, a mute groundskeeper whose silence was as permanent as the scars that covered his throat, a remnant, local said, of a Confederate bayonet. The orphanage operated on donations from the local church and whatever meager crops Thomas could coax from the unforgiving soil. Life was hard, but it was life. The children had beds, meals, and prayers. They had routine, they had safety, or so everyone believed. On the morning of September 14, 1876, Sister Agnes found 7-year-old Marie Dutoit in her bed, cold and impossibly pale. The child's lips were blue, her eyes half open and glassy, but it was her neck that made Sister Agnes drop the oil lamp she was carrying. 2 puncture marks, precise and deep, marred the side of Marie's throat. The skin around the wounds was bruised purple and black, as if something had fed there with terrible hunger. The local doctor, Edmund Voss, examined the body and recorded in his notes that still exist in the Belmont Historical Society archives, that Marie had died from extreme exsanguination of unknown origin. She had quite literally been drained of blood, but Dr. Voss could offer no explanation for how. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that Marie had even woken during whatever happened to her. The death was ruled a tragic mystery. Marie was buried in the small cemetery behind the orphanage, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross. The other children were told she had died of fever in the night. Life continued. But 3 weeks later, it happened again. 9-year-old Samuel Broussard was found in the same condition, pale, cold, 2 marks on his neck, drained of nearly all his blood. This time, another child, 10-year-old Eliza Marchand, reported seeing a tall shadow moving through the dormitory the night before Samuel's death. A shadow that seemed to bend and stretch in ways that defied the geometry of lamplight. A shadow that stood over Samuel's bed for what felt like hours, perfectly still, before disappearing through the wall itself. Sister Agnes wrote in her private diary, now preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, "I fear something unholy has taken residence in St. Catherine's. The children whisper of a figure in black who visits after midnight. Thomas found tracks in the mud outside the dormitory window, barefoot and impossibly large. I have begun sleeping with my Bible and rosary, but I wonder if faith alone will be enough to combat what stalks these halls." What was killing the children of St. Catherine's Orphanage? Was it disease, a human predator, or something far older, something that belonged to the dark folklore of Louisiana's swamps, a creature that fed on the innocent and left only empty husks behind? The answers lie buried in archives, testimonies, and photographs that have survived nearly a century and a half, and tonight we will unearth them all. To understand what happened at St. Catherine's, we must first understand the world that surrounded it. Louisiana in 1876 was a place still bleeding from the wounds of war. The Civil War had ended 11 years prior, but Reconstruction had brought its own horrors: political chaos, economic collapse, and a social order turned violently upside down. The South was a landscape of abandoned plantations, burned towns, and families torn apart by death and displacement. Belmont was a small town of roughly 800 souls, nestled in the swamplands of Ascension Parish. It had once been a modest hub for sugarcane processing, but the war had destroyed its infrastructure. By 1876, it was a dying town, its population dwindling, its buildings falling into disrepair, its future uncertain. The main road was often impassable due to flooding, and the nearest city, Baton Rouge, lay 2 days away by horse and cart. The town's isolation was both geographical and cultural. Belmont existed at the intersection of French Creole, Acadian, and African influences, creating a unique blend of Catholicism, folk magic, and ancestral superstition. Old women still sold gris-gris bags in the market. Men avoided certain sections of the swamp where they claimed the rougarou, the Cajun werewolf, stalked at night. And everyone, regardless of education or social standing, knew the stories of the buveurs de sang, the blood drinkers that allegedly haunted the bayous since before recorded history. These were not stories told lightly. They were warnings passed down through generations, woven into the fabric of daily life. If a child wandered too far into the swamp, they were told the buveurs would take them. If livestock was found dead and drained, the old folks nodded knowingly. The rationale might dismiss such tales as superstition, but in Belmont, the line between the natural and supernatural had always been thin. St. Catherine's Orphanage was established in 1868 by the Catholic Diocese of Baton Rouge as part of a broader effort to care for the war's orphans. The building itself had a darker history. It was originally the Devereux Manor, built in 1842 by plantation owner Augustin Devereux. Augustin died under mysterious circumstances in 1855, and his widow Celeste followed him to the grave just 3 weeks later. Locals claimed the house was cursed, and it sat empty for over a decade before the church purchased it for a fraction of its value. Father Raymond Colbert oversaw the orphanage's opening and personally recruited Sister Agnes Thornhill to serve as its matron. Sister Agnes came from Boston, a woman of stern New England sensibility who had devoted her life to the church after losing her own family to typhoid fever. She was described in correspondence as unwavering in faith, sharp in mind, and utterly devoted to the children under her care. The Belmont Gazette, in an edition dated March 12, 1868, reported, "St. Catherine's Orphanage opened its doors this week, offering refuge to 12 children displaced by the recent conflicts. Sister Agnes Thornhill leads the institution with a firm but loving hand. The community is grateful for this beacon of hope in these troubled times." By 1876, that number had grown to 23 children, ranging in age from 4 to 14. Most were orphans of Confederate soldiers, though a few had been abandoned by parents too destitute to feed them. The children worked daily, tending the small garden, mending clothes, learning basic literacy from Sister Agnes. It was a hard life, but no harder than most in that era. Thomas Rave, the groundskeeper, was as much a mystery as the place itself. He had appeared at the orphanage's doorstep in 1869, carrying a note that simply read, "This man seeks honest work and has no voice to ask for it himself. Show him Christian mercy." The note was unsigned. Sister Agnes, moved by compassion, hired him. Thomas proved invaluable. He could repair anything, coax crops from stubborn soil, and had an uncanny ability to calm frightened children despite his inability to speak. His muteness was the result of a wartime injury. The jagged scar across his throat suggested a blade had severed his vocal cords. He communicated through gestures and occasionally wrote brief messages on a small chalkboard he carried. The children initially feared him, his towering height, his scarred face, his perpetual silence, but they grew to trust him. He carved wooden toys for them, protected them from snakes in the garden, and once carried a sick child 3 miles through a storm to reach Dr. Voss. Sister Agnes wrote of him in her diary, "Thomas is a godsend. He asks for nothing but a roof and daily bread. I believe God sent him to us for a purpose, though I cannot yet fathom what that purpose might be." The orphanage operated on a strict schedule. The children rose at dawn, attended morning prayers, completed their chores, received lessons, ate their meager meals, and were in bed by sundown. Discipline was maintained through prayer and occasional denial of dessert. Sister Agnes did not believe in physical punishment. The building itself was draughty and old, prone to strange creaks and groans, but it was home. In the summer of 1876, the orphanage received an unusual donation from an anonymous benefactor. A large shipment of candles, blankets, and preserved foods, along with a curious item, a wooden box containing dozens of small iron crucifixes. A note accompanying the delivery read, "For the protection of the innocent, may these wards keep evil at bay." Sister Agnes distributed the crucifixes to the children, instructing them to wear them at all times. This donation arrived in early August, just 5 weeks before Marie Dutoit's death. The Belmont community, though poor, supported the orphanage as best they could. Local farmers donated surplus vegetables. The church provided monthly stipends. Women from town occasionally visited to teach the girls sewing or the boys basic carpentry. But the orphanage remained isolated. 3 miles of swamp and forest separated it from the town proper, and visits decreased in winter when the roads became impassable. This isolation would prove crucial. When the deaths began, news traveled slowly. By the time the outside world understood the horror unfolding at St. Catherine's, multiple children were already dead, and something unspeakable had already taken up residence within those walls. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in September of 1876, the nightmare truly began. Marie Dutoit's death on September 14, 1876, should have been the end of it, a tragic anomaly, a medical mystery that would remain unsolved but isolated. But 3 weeks later, when Samuel Broussard was found in the exact same condition, the atmosphere at St. Catherine's changed completely. Fear took root. Sister Agnes immediately wrote to Father Colbert in Baton Rouge, describing the deaths in detail. Her letter, dated October 7, 1876, still exists in the diocesan archives. In it she writes, "2 of our children have perished under circumstances that defy medical explanation. Dr. Voss can offer no natural cause. The children speak of shadows and visitors in the night. I beg you, Father, send help, send answers, send anyone who might understand what walks these halls after dark." Father Colbert's response took 11 days to arrive. In it, he suggested the deaths might be the result of a wasting disease, or perhaps contaminated water from the nearby swamp. He advised Sister Agnes to boil all drinking water, ensure proper ventilation, and lead the children in nightly prayers for protection. He did not visit. He did not send help. The orphanage remained alone. Dr. Edmund Voss, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation. His medical journal, preserved in the Louisiana Medical Historical Collection, contains detailed entries about the deaths. After examining Samuel's body, he wrote, "The exsanguination is total and precise. Whatever drained this child did so with surgical accuracy, leaving the body otherwise unmarked. There is no lividity where one would expect it. suggesting the blood was removed while the heart still beat. This contradicts all known post-mortem phenomena. I am at a loss. Dr. Voss attempted to interview the children, but most were too terrified to speak coherently. 10-year-old Eliza Marchand, however, provided the most detailed testimony. In a statement recorded by Dr. Voss on October 9th, she said, "I saw it standing over Samuel's bed. It was tall, taller than Mr. Thomas, taller than anyone I've ever seen. It wore black clothes, or maybe it was made of black. I couldn't see its face, just darkness where a face should be. It bent down over Samuel, and I heard drinking sounds, like when you drink from a cup, but slower, wetter. Samuel didn't move, didn't scream. It was like he was asleep the whole time. Then the thing looked at me. I felt its eyes, even though I couldn't see them. I closed my eyes tight and prayed until morning. When I opened them, it was gone, and Samuel was in gold." Dr. Voss noted in his journal, "The child exhibits genuine trauma. Her account, while fantastical, is delivered with absolute conviction. Either she witnessed something truly inexplicable, or her young mind has constructed an elaborate fiction to explain a horror she cannot otherwise process." Thomas Rave made his own discovery. On the morning of October 10th, he found tracks in the soft mud beneath the dormitory window, the same window near Samuel's bed. The tracks were described in Sheriff Marcel Thibodeau's report as bare footprints of unusual length, approximately 14 inches, with abnormally long toes and a stride pattern suggesting a gait that is neither fully human nor animal. Thomas made a plaster cast of one print, which Sister Agnes kept in a locked drawer in her office. That cast would later disappear under mysterious circumstances, but not before being photographed by a traveling journalist in 1877. The children began exhibiting signs of mass hysteria. 12-year-old Peter Ashford refused to sleep, keeping himself awake by pinching his arms until they bled. 6-year-old twins, Anna and Charlotte Benoit, would scream if anyone tried to extinguish the candles in their room. 11-year-old Joseph Landry began drawing disturbing images, tall, skeletal figures with impossibly long arms reaching towards small, cowering children. Sister Agnes documented everything in her diary. On October 15th, she wrote, "The orphanage has become a prison of fear. The children will not sleep unless every candle is lit, every crucifix visible. They huddle together in the center of the room, away from windows and walls. I do not blame them. I confess I share their terror. Last night I heard footsteps in the hall outside my room, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped at my door. I waited, rosary clutched in my hands for the door to open. It never did. But I heard breathing, deep, wet breathing, as if whatever stood there had just run a great distance. Or fed." On October 22nd, the pattern broke. Instead of another child dying, something else happened. Thomas Rave was found unconscious in the garden at dawn, his body covered in deep scratches and his clothes torn. When he regained consciousness, he frantically wrote on his chalkboard, "It came for me. I fought it. It ran." Beneath his fingernails, Dr. Voss found traces of a black, tar-like substance that he could not identify. Thomas recovered physically, but he was never the same. He began sleeping during the day and patrolling the orphanage grounds at night, carrying an iron poker and wearing every crucifix he could find strung around his neck. Sister Agnes noted, "Thomas has become our nocturnal guardian. He will not explain what attacked him, but his message is clear. He believes something can be fought, can be driven away. This gives me hope, however fragile." But hope was short-lived. On November 3rd, 1876, 2 children died in a single night. 14-year-old Rebecca Fontaine and 8-year-old Lucas Arsenault were both found in their beds, pale and drained, bearing the same twin puncture wounds on their necks. This time, multiple children reported seeing not one figure, but two, both tall, both cloaked in black, both moving with unnatural silence through the dormitory. Sheriff Thibodeau finally intervened. He arrived at St. Catherine's on November 5th with 3 deputies and conducted a thorough search of the building and grounds. His official report, filed with the parish courthouse, states, "Despite exhaustive investigation, we found no evidence of human intrusion. All windows and doors were locked from the inside. No footprints were discovered inside the building. The children's testimonies are consistent, but describe entities that cannot exist within rational understanding. I am forced to conclude that either a mass delusion has taken hold or something beyond my jurisdiction is at work here." Tell us in the comments what you think is happening. So far, is this a supernatural predator or something even darker? Your theories keep this investigation alive. Sister Agnes made a desperate decision. On November 8th, she invited Marguerite Toussaint, a local Creole woman known for her knowledge of folk remedies and protective magic, to bless the orphanage. Marguerite walked through every room, burning sage and muttering prayers in French, and what Sister Agnes described as a language older than French, guttural and strange. Marguerite placed bags of salt, iron filings and dried herbs at every entrance. She painted symbols on the walls in red ochre, symbols that Sister Agnes later tried to research but could find in no religious text. When Marguerite finished, she told Sister Agnes in broken English, "What hunts here is old, older than this land, older than our people. It feeds on the young because their blood is pure, untouched by sin or sickness. My protections will slow it, but they will not stop it forever. You must find where it sleeps. You must destroy its resting place. If you do not, it will take every child in this house one by one until none remain." Sister Agnes asked where such a creature might sleep. Marguerite pointed toward the swamp and said simply, "In the earth, in the dark, where things rot." That night, for the first time in weeks, no child died. The protections seemed to work, but Sister Agnes knew in her heart that this was only a reprieve. The nightmare at St. Catherine's was far from over. Marguerite's protections held for 9 days, 9 days of restless peace where the children slept with candles burning and crucifixes clutched to their chests. 9 days where Thomas patrolled the grounds without incident. 9 days where Sister Agnes allowed herself to believe the worst had passed. On November 17th, that illusion shattered. 5-year-old Catherine Heber vanished from her bed. Not dead, vanished. Her blankets were thrown back, her small shoes still beside the bed, but Catherine herself was gone. The other children heard nothing. Thomas, who had been patrolling the east side of the building, saw nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist between the hours of midnight and dawn. Sister Agnes organized an immediate search. Every room, every closet, every corner of St. Catherine's was examined. Sheriff Thibodeau returned with additional men. They searched the surrounding woods and swampland for 3 days. Catherine Heber was not found. On the 4th day of searching, Thomas made a discovery that would change everything. He was in the orphanage's root cellar, a cramped earthen space beneath the kitchen where vegetables and preserved foods were stored, when he noticed something unusual. The back wall, which he had always assumed was solid earth, had a section that sounded hollow when struck. Thomas began digging with his bare hands. Within minutes, he uncovered wooden boards hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt. The boards were old, rotted in places, and bore strange symbols carved into their surface, the same symbols Marguerite had painted on the walls. Behind those boards was a passageway. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through, and it descended at a steep angle into absolute darkness. The air that emerged from it was cold and carried a smell that Thomas would later describe in writing as like meat left in summer heat, but older. sweeter. Wrong. Sister Agnes was summoned. She stood at the mouth of that tunnel with Thomas, Sheriff Thibodeau, and 2 deputies. The sheriff volunteered to investigate, taking 2 oil lamps and a pistol. He ordered everyone to remain at the entrance and descended into the passage. He was gone for 37 minutes. When he emerged, his face was ashen, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his lamp. In his report, filed the next day, he wrote, "What I discovered beneath St. Catherine's Orphanage will haunt me until my final breath. The passage opens into a chamber approximately 20 feet below ground level. The chamber appears to be a natural cave formation that has been modified, the walls smoothed, alcoves carved into the stone. In these alcoves I found the bodies of children. Not recent deaths, these were old, mummified by the cool, dry air of the cave. I counted 14 in total, though the lamplight did not reach all corners. Some wore clothing styles from decades past. One child wore a dress I recognized from an old photograph, a style popular in the 1840s. These children had been down there for 30 years or more, and every single one bore the same marks on their necks, the same twin puncture wounds. But that was not the worst discovery. In the center of the chamber, Sheriff Thibodeau found a stone altar. On that altar lay Catherine Hebert. She was alive but unconscious, her skin pale and cold. Beside her was a collection of objects, a silver chalice stained dark with old blood, dozens of iron nails, arranged in circular patterns, journals written in multiple languages, and most disturbingly, a ledger. The ledger contained names, dates, locations. It was a feeding record spanning over 80 years, meticulously documenting every victim taken from the orphanage and before that, from the Devereux plantation that once stood on this land. The entries were written in the same hand throughout, a flowing, elegant script that never changed despite the decades between entries. The most recent entry read, Catherine Hebert, 5 years, November 17, 1876, prepared for the grand feeding. Catherine was brought out of the cellar and immediately taken to Dr. Voss. She was alive but catatonic, her eyes open but unseeing, her body cold despite being wrapped in blankets. Dr. Voss could find no medical explanation for her condition. He wrote, "The child appears to be in a state of profound shock, or perhaps something I have no words to describe. Her pulse is present but weak, her breathing shallow. It is as if her very life force has been partially drained, leaving only enough to sustain basic functions." Catherine would remain in this state for 3 weeks before suddenly awakening with no memory of her ordeal. Meanwhile, Sheriff Thibodeau retrieved everything from the underground chamber, the bodies, the altar items, and most importantly, the journals. There were 7 journals in total, each filled with hundreds of pages of writing. The first was dated 1794. The last entry was from November 1876. The journals were written in French, English, and Latin, sometimes switching languages mid-sentence. Father Colbert was finally summoned from Baton Rouge to help translate the Latin passages. What he read disturbed him so profoundly that he initially refused to share the contents. Only under pressure from Sheriff Thibodeau did he reveal what the journals contained. They were the chronicle of Augustin Devereux, the original owner of the property, but they were not the writings of a man. They were the writings of something that had been Augustin Devereux, then became something else. The first journal began innocuously enough. Augustin wrote about his plantation, his business dealings, his marriage to Celeste. But in 1843, he documented an encounter in the deep swamp. He and several enslaved workers had been cutting timber when they discovered a cave that the local Huma people warned them never to enter, claiming it was the dwelling place of an ancient evil. Augustin, dismissive of native superstitions, entered the cave. He wrote, Within that darkness, I found a coffin of stone, sealed with symbols I did not recognize. My men refused to help me open it. Cowards! I broke the seal myself with hammer and chisel. Inside was a body, perfectly preserved despite obvious age. It wore clothing from another century, perhaps from the Spanish colonial period. Its hands were folded across its chest, and its face, though gaunt, possessed a terrible beauty. I touched its hand, curious if the preservation was natural or artificial. Its eyes opened, it smiled, and in that moment I felt something enter me, cold, ancient, and ravenously hungry. From that day forward, Augustin Devereux was no longer entirely human. The entity that had lain dormant in that stone coffin for unknown centuries had found a new host. Augustin documented his transformation with clinical detachment. He described the growing hunger for blood, the inability to tolerate sunlight, the enhanced strength and senses, and the terrible realization that he would outlive everyone he had ever known. His wife, Celeste, discovered his nature after finding him feeding on one of the household servants. Augustin killed her to protect his secret. Her death was recorded publicly as illness, but in his journal he wrote, "I drank from her throat as she wept and begged. I felt nothing but satisfaction. The man I was died in that cave. What remains is appetite." For 12 years, Augustin fed on the enslaved people of his plantation, careful never to take too many, always covering his tracks. But when the plantation failed and the property was abandoned, he faced a problem. His food source was disappearing. The solution came in 1868 when the Catholic Church purchased the property and established an orphanage. Augustin wrote, "Orphans, perfect. No one to miss them, no one to investigate too closely. The Church has provided me with an endless supply, and they call it charity." But how could Augustin still be active in 1876 if he died in 1855? The answer lay in the later journals. Augustin had not died. He had staged his death and retreated to the underground chamber, living in the cave system that connected to the cellar. The entity that possessed him had taught him how to enter a death-like state, how to slow his aging, how to move unseen through the world above. He had watched the orphanage being built directly above his lair. He had watched children arrive, and he had fed methodically and patiently for 8 years. Armed with this knowledge, Sheriff Thibodeau organized a hunting party. 10 men, all carrying rifles, torches, and iron implements. Marguerite had insisted iron could harm such creatures. They descended into the cellar passage on November 25, 1876, determined to find Augustin Devereux and end his reign of terror. The underground chamber was larger than initially believed. Beyond the first room, the cave system extended deep into the earth, labyrinth of natural passages and carved alcoves. The hunting party marked their path with chalk, moving cautiously through the darkness. They found Augustin's true lair 3 hours into their search. It was a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow above. The walls were covered in symbols, thousands of them, painted in what appeared to be dried blood. In the center of the cavern stood a stone sarcophagus, its lid carved with the image of a skeletal figure drinking from a chalice. Surrounding the sarcophagus were the mummified remains of dozens of victims, arranged in concentric circles like a grotesque audience. Augustin was not there, but his presence was felt. The temperature in the cavern dropped suddenly. The torches flickered and dimmed despite no wind, and from somewhere in the darkness above, a voice spoke, cultured, amused, and utterly inhuman. "You have entered my sanctuary uninvited. How rude." What happened next is documented in the sworn testimonies of 3 survivors. Augustin Devereux emerged from the shadows, not walking, but descending from the ceiling itself, his body contorted in ways that defied human anatomy. He wore the same black clothes from the children's descriptions, but his face was visible now. It was Augustine's face, recognizable from old photographs, but transformed. His skin was paper white, stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes were entirely black. His mouth, when he smiled, revealed teeth that had been filed to points. He killed 4 men in seconds. The testimonies describe him moving faster than sight, tearing throats with his bare hands, draining one man completely before the others could react. The survivors opened fire, but bullets seemed to pass through him without effect. Or perhaps he moved too quickly to be hit. The testimonies conflict on this detail. Thomas Rev, who had insisted on joining the hunting party despite Sister Agnes's protests, did something unexpected. He threw himself at Augustine, driving an iron poker through the creature's chest. Augustine screamed, a sound described as like wind through a tomb, and staggered backward. The iron had hurt him. The surviving men pressed their advantage. They drove Augustine back toward his sarcophagus, striking him repeatedly with iron tools, splashing him with holy water that Father Colbert had provided. Augustine fought with superhuman strength, but the combined assault of iron and faith began to take its toll. His movements slowed. His skin began to crack and blacken. In a final act of desperation, Augustine lunged toward the passage leading back to the orphanage. Thomas blocked his path. The two struggled, and in that struggle, Thomas managed to tear the creature's throat with an iron crucifix, the same throat where Thomas himself bore scars. Augustine collapsed, his body convulsing. Black fluid poured from his wounds. He looked up at Thomas and spoke his final words. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive. I am not the first. I will not be the last. This land is soaked in blood older than your God. We will always return." The survivors doused Augustine's body in oil and set it ablaze. They burned the sarcophagus, the mummified victims, the journals, everything. The cavern became an inferno. The hunting party barely escaped before the smoke and flames filled the passage. Sheriff Thibodeau sealed the cellar entrance with brick and mortar. Father Colbert blessed the ground. Marguerite performed her own rituals, speaking words in that ancient language. The orphanage was declared safe. But was it? The immediate horror ended in November 1876, but the story of St. Catherine's Orphanage did not. What remained were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that would surface over the following decades, each one adding new layers to the mystery, each one suggesting that perhaps the nightmare had never truly ended. St. Catherine's continued to operate until 1923, when declining enrollment and the building's deteriorating condition forced the diocese to close it permanently. In those 47 years of continued operation, no further deaths matching the pattern of 1876 were officially recorded. The orphanage became, by all accounts, a normal institution, harsh by modern standards, but no more haunted than any other building of its era. But was it truly free of the curse? In 1952, a graduate student named Robert Ashford, grandson of Peter Ashford, one of the surviving orphans from 1876, undertook a research project on Louisiana, orphanages, for his master's thesis at Tulane University. While interviewing elderly residents of Bellamont, he discovered something disturbing. Between 1877 and 1923, 16 children had disappeared from St. Catherine's. Not died, disappeared. Their disappearances were attributed to runaways or children reclaimed by distant relatives, but no records existed of these children ever being found or officially adopted. Robert's thesis, titled Lost Children, A Statistical Analysis of Orphanage Operations in Post-Reconstruction Louisiana, notes, the pattern is subtle but present. Approximately every 3 to 4 years, A child would vanish from St. Catherine's without adequate documentation. This rate is higher than comparable institutions by a factor of 3. While not conclusive evidence of foul play, it suggests systematic record-keeping failures or something more sinister. Robert attempted to access the sealed cellar, but the diocese denied his request. The official statement claimed the cellar had collapsed in 1924 during demolition preparations and was now completely inaccessible. However, a local construction worker told Robert off the record that when his crew had been hired to demolish the building in 1947, they found the cellar entrance still intact, still sealed, and they were specifically ordered not to break the seal. The demolition was ultimately cancelled due to structural concerns. In 1968, the abandoned orphanage building was purchased by a real estate developer who planned to convert it into apartments. During renovation, workers discovered something in the walls, hidden behind plaster in what had been Sister Agnes's office. It was a metal box, carefully concealed and forgotten for over 90 years. Inside the box were items that had not been burned in 1876. 3 of Augustine's journals that Sister Agnes had secretly kept, a dozen photographs of the mummified victims found in the cavern, the plaster cast of the impossible footprint, and Sister Agnes's personal diary covering the months after the confrontation. These items were donated to the Belmont Historical Society, where they remain to this day, though access is restricted. I was able to review photocopies through a research request, and what Sister Agnes wrote in the months following Augustine's destruction is deeply unsettling. Her entry from December 3, 1876 reads, "We tell ourselves it is over. We hold services of thanksgiving. We smile at the children and assure them they are safe, but I do not believe it. Thomas does not believe it. We hear sounds at night, the same footsteps, the same wet breathing outside doors. 3 nights ago, I found fresh scratches on the outside of my window, as if something had been testing whether it could enter. The protections Marguerite placed are weakening. I can feel it. Whatever Augustine was, whatever possessed him, I fear it cannot be destroyed by fire. I fear it simply waits." On January 19, 1877, she wrote, "Thomas no longer sleeps. He patrols every night, armed with iron and prayer. Last night he encountered something near the tree line. He will not describe it, but he showed me his chalkboard, upon which he had written a single word, over and over, until the chalk broke. Brother. What did he mean? Does Augustine have a brother? Or is Thomas trying to tell me that whatever haunted us has multiplied?" Sister Agnes's final entry, dated March 7, 1877, is the most chilling. "I have made a terrible discovery. While researching the symbols Marguerite used, I found reference to them in a book of Louisiana folklore. They are not protection symbols, they are binding symbols. They do not keep evil out, they keep it contained. Marguerite did not save us. She imprisoned it, and prisons eventually fail. The diary ends there. Sister Agnes died in 1891 of natural causes, having served St. Catherine's for 23 years. Thomas Rave disappeared in 1894. He was last seen walking into the swamp one evening, and simply never returned. His body was never found. In 1977, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen attempted to create a film about St. Catherine's. She interviewed the few remaining people who had any connection to the orphanage, children of former staff, elderly Belmont residents, and one woman who claimed to be a distant relative of Marguerite Toussaint. This woman, who gave her name only as Marie, told Sarah something that was cut from the final documentary but exists in the raw footage. She said, "My great-great-grandmother did what she could with the knowledge she had. But that thing, the entity that used Augustin Devereux, it is not unique. There are others, many others. They sleep in the dark places of Louisiana, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake them or for their bindings to weaken. The orphanage was built on cursed ground, and curses have deep roots. You want to know if it's over? Go to the site at night. See if you can stand there for 1 hour without running. Then tell me if it's over. Sarah and her crew did attempt to film at the site in 1977. The building had been demolished by then, leaving only the foundation and the overgrown cemetery. They set up cameras and recording equipment at dusk, planning to film overnight. At 11:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on the surviving footage, their equipment began malfunctioning. Cameras shut off randomly. Audio recordings captured sounds that were not audible to the crew at the time. Whispers in French, children crying, and beneath it all a rhythmic sound like slow, heavy breathing. At 12:03 a.m., one of the cameramen saw a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery. He described it as impossibly tall, dressed in black, standing perfectly still. When he called to the others, the figure vanished. The crew abandoned the shoot and never returned. In 1985, the Bellemont Town Council erected a historical marker at the site, commemorating St. Catherine's Orphanage and the children who lived there. The marker makes no mention of the deaths, the disappearances, or the horror that occurred there. It simply reads, St. Catherine's Orphanage, 1868-1923. A refuge for Louisiana's forgotten children. But the locals know better. They avoid the site, especially after dark, and on certain nights, November nights, when the fog rolls thick through the cypress trees, some claim they can still hear children singing. The old hymns Sister Agnes taught them, voices thin and distant, as if coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. In 2003, a paranormal investigation team received permission to study the site. They placed electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and audio recorders across the property. Their findings, published online, documented hundreds of anomalies, temperature drops, electromagnetic spikes, and audio recordings of what they classified as disembodied voices. One recording, captured at 2:17 a.m., allegedly contains a voice whispering, in French, Les enfants sont toujours ici. Nous avons encore faim. The children are still here. We are still hungry. The investigation team never returned for a follow-up study. When contacted for interviews, most members declined to discuss their experience. One member, speaking anonymously, said only, "Some places are hungry. That place is starving." So what really happened at St. Catherine's Orphanage? What stalked those halls in 1876, draining children of their blood and leaving only pale corpses behind? After reviewing hundreds of documents, testimonies, photographs, and journal entries, I can offer you no definitive answer. Only theories, only possibilities, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most terrifying aspect of all. Theory 1, the supernatural predator. The evidence supporting this interpretation is substantial. The journals of Augustin Devereux document a transformation that aligns with vampire folklore across multiple cultures. The inability of bullets to harm him, the aversion to iron and holy symbols, the feeding pattern, the superhuman strength, all consistent with centuries of vampire mythology. If we accept this theory, then we must also accept that something ancient and evil was awakened in that Louisiana cave in 1843, something that possessed Augustin and continued to hunt long after his human life should have ended. The question this theory raises is whether the entity died with Augustin in that burning cavern, or whether it survived, perhaps finding a new host, perhaps still bound by Marguerite's symbols, waiting for those bindings to weaken enough to feed again. Theory 2. The human monster. Perhaps Augustin Devereux was not possessed by anything supernatural. Perhaps he was simply a man who convinced himself he was a monster and acted accordingly. Serial killers have existed throughout history, and many have created elaborate mythologies around their crimes. The journals could be the ravings of a madman. The superhuman abilities could be exaggerations born from panic and poor lighting. The survivors saw what they expected to see, what their culture and superstitions prepared them to see. In this interpretation, Augustine was killed in 1876, his body burned, and the murders stopped because the murderer was dead. The subsequent disappearances could be unrelated, the result of the high child mortality rates common in that era, combined with poor record-keeping and institutional neglect. Theory 3. The curse remains. This is perhaps the darkest possibility, that Augustin Devereux was both victim and perpetrator, that he truly was possessed by an entity older than recorded history, that this entity cannot be destroyed by conventional means because it is not a physical being but a spiritual contamination. Sister Agnes's discovery that Marguerite's symbols were binding rather than protective suggests the entity was never destroyed, merely contained, and containment is temporary. The abandoned site, the continuing anomalies, the reports from investigators across decades, all point to something that remains, something that waits, something that hungers. If this theory is true, then St. Catherine's Orphanage was not the end of the story, but merely one chapter in a chronicle that stretches backward into forgotten history and forward into an uncertain future. To this day, no one knows the truth. The site remains undeveloped, avoided by locals, visited only by the curious and the foolish. The Bellemont Historical Society maintains its restricted archive, preserving documents that raise more questions than they answer. The descendants of the survivors carry the weight of their ancestors' trauma, and some claim to experience dreams, recurring nightmares of orphanages, of tall figures in black, of children singing in the darkness. I leave you with one final piece of evidence. In 2019, a construction crew was hired to build a shopping center on land adjacent to the original orphanage site. During excavation, they discovered an underground cavity, part of the same cave system that Augustine used as his lair. Inside, they found bones, small bones, children's bones. The police were called. The remains were analyzed. The bones dated to different time periods, spanning over 200 years. Some showed the same pattern of trauma to the neck vertebrae, consistent with extreme exsanguination. The construction was halted. The cavity was sealed with concrete. No shopping center was ever built. Whatever haunted St. Catherine's Orphanage may still be there, beneath the Louisiana soil, bound by weakening symbols, waiting in the darkness. Or perhaps it walks among us now, wearing a new face, hunting in a new territory. Perhaps it never left at all. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Louisiana's darkest mysteries. If this story has unsettled you, and it should, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Our haunted community grows stronger with each new member, and there are many more forgotten horrors waiting to be uncovered. Share your theories in the comments below. Do you believe Augustin Devereux was possessed by an ancient evil, or was he simply a monster of the human variety? Do you think the curse remains, or did it die in those flames in 1876? Until our next investigation, remember, history buries its darkest secrets, but it never buries them deep enough. Stay curious, stay cautious, and never, ever ignore the warnings whispered by those who came before us. Good night wherever you are, and sleep well, if you can.